Hello, this is John T. Rhapsodes Esquire, purveyor of awesome old-school audio stories, bringing you another Sut Lovingood story today from 1867 called Old Skissom's Middle Boy by George Washington Harris. George Harris walked the earth, or as Sut would say, the yeath, from 1814 to 1869. Mostly in East Tennessee. In 1867, Harris published a book titled Sut Lovingood, Yarns Spun By Natural Born Durn'd Fool, containing 24 stories involving his crazy-like-a-fox rural Appalachian character Sut Lovingood, who was based on a friend Harris made while surveying copper mines named William Sut Miller. Hear the words of old. Old Skissom's Middle Boy, from 1867, by George Washington Harris. When I were a little over half growed, and had sprouted my tail feathers and were beginning to crow, there were a living in the neighborhood a dreadful, fat, mean, lazy boy 'bout my age. He were the middle son of an old lark named Skissim. Old Skissim tinkered on the old clocks and spinning wheels, ate hominy corn, and exhorted at prayer meetings for a living, while this middle boy of his did the sleeping for the whole family. He could beat a hog and a hungry dog eating, and then beat his eating with his sleeping as bad as his eating beat the eating of a rat after being shut in a church, or a snake in a jug with no mouth to it. They waked the middle boy to eat, and then had to wake him again to make him quit eating. Waked him to go to the spring, and waked him to start back again. Waked him to say his prayers, and waked him to stop saying them. In fact, they were always awaking him, and he were always a-going to sleep again. Sometimes old Skissim waked his middle boy by cracking a wagon whip, what he toted for that purpose. Sometimes he waked him with the tea kettle and scalding water. Both the cracking whip and the water lost their virtue eventually, and they just gave him over to unending sleeping and unmitigated hardness of head. Charlie Dickens's son, the fat boy, referring to a fat and sleepy character in Charles Dickens's Pickwick Papers, might have been as nigh kin to him as a second cousin, if his mama were a powerful wakeful woman. Now I hadn't found out yet back then, certainly, that I were a natural born durned fool. I sort of suspicioned it, but still had hopes. So I were a fool enough to think I were smart enough to break the Skissom's middle boy from snoozing all the time. So I lay awake of nights for a week, fixing the way to do it. And that minds me to tell you what I thinks of planning and studying. It is generally no count. All depends, at last, on what you does and how you carries yourself at the moment of action. Circumstances turn about powerful fast, and all you can do is to think just as fast as they can turn, and just as they turn. And if you do this, I'm durned if you don't get out somehow. Long studying is like preparing a supply of water into a wormhole barrel to put out fire. When the fire does come, durned if you don't have to hustle round powerful fast and get more water, for there's none in the barrel. But as I were a-telling you, I studied out at last a plan what I thought would wake the devil, and I set in to carrying it out. Old man Skissim and his wife went to a night prayer meeting and took the balance of his, or rather her, brats. A feller should always be powerful careful in speaking on that point. I've always heard that it took a monstrous wise brat to know its daddy, and I think it takes a wiser daddy to know his own brats. My daddy never would speak certain about any of our family but me, and he counted for that by saying I were a long shot too cussed a fool to belong to anybody else, so I am a Lovingood for sure. My long legs sometimes sort of bothers me, but then again, Mama took a powerful scare one time at a sandhill crane, a-sittin' on a peeled well pole, and she outrun her shadow 30 yards in coming half a mile. I expect I owes my legs and speed to that circumstance, and not to any fraud on Mama's part. Well, anyhow, the Skissims went to a night prayer meeting and left their middle boy in the kitchen fast asleep, believing to find him right there when they come back. But they were mistaken that pop, for when they come back, they found the widest awake boy ever born in that or any other house, or out indoors either. And as to being right there, in the head that is, he warn't by a darn sight. He were here, there, and everywhere at the same time, and if he had any appetite for victuals just then, he didn't hand out a sign that I could see. They left their middle boy sitting onto a split-bottom chair, plumb asleep all over, even to his old hat. While the boy was still sleeping, I snuck inside and took about 30 foot of clothesline and tied him to the chair by his neck, body, and arms, leaving his legs loose. He looked sort of like the lion in the spelling book when the rat were a-cutting a fishnet off him. I had the boy safe now to practice on, and I set into doing it, sort of this way. I painted his face the color of a coal burner to make him look like a haint. He were a fine picture to study if your mind were fond of scary things. That boy looked savage as a set steel trap baited with arsenic, and were just fit for treason, stratagem, and to spoil things. To this day, when I dreams of the devil, Daddy, Parson Bullen, and other awful oppressive things, that infernal boy, as he looked that night, is dern intermittently mixed with the whole of 'em. I expect he's dead now as the reason of it. I screwed onto each of his ears a pair of iron hand vices, what his daddy squeezed old clocks and cracked walnuts with, and they hung down like overgrowed earrings. Then I tied a gridiron to one ankle and a pair of fire tongs to the other. I poured a bottle of ground red pepper down his back under his shirt, and I turned loose a pint of June bugs, what I caught on purpose, into his bosom, and buttoned him up. Then I tied a basket full of firecrackers to the chair back, to his hair, and to his wrists. I buttoned up a big, gray-whiskered, aggravated old mouse, tied with a string into the slack of his breeches, with the other end of the string fastened onto his gallus button on his overalls. And the mouse, like all the rest of that tribe, immediately set into trying to get out. But owing to his perverse nature, or the darkness of the place, the mouse set into moving the wrong way. I learned this fact from the chair rising from the floor and falling again just to rise immediately a little higher, and from some sounds, a mixture of snort, snore, grunt, and groan, which he were beginning to issue tolerable fast, and getting louder every bounce of the chair, and becoming more like unto a howl every pop. In the beginning of his uneasiness, the middle boy dreamed of a wagon whip. Next, he dreamed of a tea kettle as big as a still and lots of boiling water. And next, he dreamed of both of 'em, and now he were a-dreaming that the tea kettle were a steam engine, a-driving the wagon whip and a cotton gin with red-hot saws 1,500 licks a minute, and that he were in the cotton hopper. I now thought it nigh on to the proper time to light the firecrackers, so as to have everything bear its share in the contemplated common wakening, and I did it. With the industry of that energetic old mouse, the sarching of the red pepper, and the promiscuous scratching round of the bugs, The first handful of firecrackers helped to begin to wake him up sort of gradual. A little faster than light bread rises, and a little slower than a yeathquake wakes a weasel. A few hundred more firecrackers went off, still having the mouse, pepper, and insects to back 'em. Got him wide enough awake to believe that he were threatened with some awful personal calamity what wanted powerful quick work on his part to dodge. The middle boy were awake now all over, even to his durned old hat, and he showed it in as many ways as a cat does, locked up in an empty room with a strange and enterprising big dog. He grabbed the fire shovel and bounced half bent, since the chair kept him from straightening up, all over that kitchen, striking overhanded, underhanded, uphanded, downhanded, and left-handed at every suspicious shadow he seed. He had his fit by the light of 10 million sparks. He were as active as a smut machine in full blast, and every grain of wheat a spark. And he were a hollerin' everything anybody ever did holler, in dreadful tribulation of spirit, even to Now I Lay Me Down to Sleep and Glory. Now when I'm in trouble, scared or tormented, I does but one thing, and that's unresistible and durned fast running, and I just keep at it till I gets comfort. Now the Skissum's middle boy's big idea under noise and variegating hurtin' were to fight, and keep on fighting until peace of mind came. I never seed such carryings on in all my born days. He made more fuss, hit more licks at more things, were in more places and in more shapes in a shorter time than any mortal auctioneer could tell if he had had as many tongues as a basket full of buckles. Every now and then the boy would gin his head a vicious, vigorous shake, and the hand vices on his ears would hit him fore and aft, till his skull rattled like unto an old gourd. Well, old Skissim and his tribe came home from the night prayer meeting finally, and hearing the unyeathly riot, thought somebody had opened a doggery, or a low-class drinking establishment, in their kitchen, and that a neighborhood fight were going on, and every feller's dog along. The Skissums rushed in to drive out the crowd and capture the whiskey, and a durneder more misfortunate mistake never were made by a man, woman, and a string of 15 brats since old Bill Shivers went for a running threshing machine to smash it, thinking it were a big music box. Old Skissim himself immediately came into contact with a wholesome knockdown, what calmed him into something monstrous like sleep for about a minute. Now a heap of things can happen in a minute, particularly if there's somebody who has set his whole soul to the business of making them happen. It were so in that kitchen. The old woman were knocked head first into the meal barrel, where she were a-breathing more meal than air, and she were snorting it up all over the edges of the barrel like it were a fountain playing cornmeal. The oldest gal were stirring first in a soap kettle, and she were a-making suds out of some of it. The next one were lengthwise belly down in the pot corner. The biggest boy were where the backlog ought to have been, onto his all fours a-scratching up all the embers and ashes a-trying to come out from there. Another child in a jacket with a 1-inch tail was knocked plumb into the pie safe among the cold victuals and things. A little gal, doll baby and all, were on the top shelf of the cupboard, among the delf, a-screaming like a little steam whistle. The neighbors were a-gathering in round the noise and rumpus, and not a dern one had the least idea what were wrong, 'ceptin' me. I understood it all, durned fool as I is. To escape from being suspicioned, I set in to cutting the chair loose as I got chances, and to keeping out of the range of that flying fire shovel the middle boy was still swinging around, for it were still spreading hurtin' and mischief on a perpetual motion plan. Everybody the shovel touched fell, and everything it come against got grief. The kitchen were a mess. The tin buckets looked like drunk men's hats all over the floor. Pails had left their hoops, and the sink were inscriptions. When the middle boy got divorced from the chair finally, I thought he'd sort of simmer down. But no, sir. He got worse, and did his work faster and better with that fire shovel. He were as crazy as a bedbug, and as savage as a mad dog. I seed a comin', an old widow, what were a powerful pious turned person, in the same church with old Skissim, and she were the news carrier general of the neighborhood. Folks said that the widow and Mr. Skissim had a religious feeling for each other, what led to many love feasts, referring to a fellowship meal referenced in the book of Jude, with nobody at them but themselves, and were both doing monstrous well, considering the thorn in the flesh, referring to Apostle Paul's statement in 2 Corinthians 12. Says she, "Oh, my soul, do tell me what has happened." "Oh, Lordy," said I, "it's a-happening yet," while a-looking awful solemn in the moonshine. Says I, "I'll tell you as I knows you won't speak of it, for if it gets out, it might make the people sort of think hard of Mr. Skissim. He came home from the prayer meeting plumb crazy, talking about the 7th commandment, which prohibits adultery, and he set into murdering his folks with a crowbar. He's done got his wife and 6 of the brats. They're a lying in there as cold as sauerkraut, and he's hot after the rest of 'em. Says he's in a hurry to get through, as he has you to kill and salt down before day. Now I know by that he's turned plumb crazy." The widow never said a word, but put out for Squire Haley's and swore her life against old Skissim, and took out a warrant for him a-charging murder, arson, blasphemy, flea-bottomery, and rape. It scared old Skissim until he run away. By the time I got done enlightening the widow, that there unquenchable Skissim middle boy had the kitchen all to himself. Everybody were afraid to go near the door. Now you couldn't guess in 10 years what he then went and did. He just made a pillar out of the chair and set in to sleeping again. If ever I'm called on to stop that boy sleeping again, I'll try a musket and 16 buckshot at just about 10 paces. And that concludes George Washington Harris's 1867 Sut Lovingood story called Old Skissim's Middle Boy. This is John T. Rhapsodies, Esquire, purveyor of awesome old-school audio stories. Thank you for listening. You can find more stories like this in the channel's playlists. Find them by staying tuned for the last 20 seconds of this video and clicking on the end screen icons. You can also go to the channel homepage and click on the playlist tab. If you enjoyed this story and would like to hear more, please help me earn the warm embrace of Mr. and Mrs. YouTubes, who look with loving favor upon those channels whose listeners faithfully subscribe, like, comment, click the notification bell, and share the videos with their friends so that they too can hear the words of old.